So I think we've established here that I'm not sure about Len Berman's suggestion that we need to provide an incentive for academics to make public policy better, but I think we are establishing the case, and I'm serious about this, that if Congress is going to proceed with this, resources at JCT to explain what they're doing are needed. And I think that the communications challenge of this thing is evident from the panel this morning, in addition to the idea that giving members of Congress incentives to do things that would increase the rate of growth doesn't seem like the worst idea we've ever come up with. But one of the very interesting parts of the House rule is that it also applies to certain spending bills. That is, mandatory spending or entitlements that would increase spending or decrease spending by about $40 billion a year. So it would have applied, for instance, to the Affordable Care Act. It would have applied to presumably to the fiscal stimulus bill. It does not apply, however, to ordinary appropriations, and there's some debate about that. So we wanted to avoid focusing only on taxes because spending matters too, and we have three people here of different viewpoints that are to help us do that. First is Donald Marin, who's, what's your title at the Urban Institute? Director of Economic Policy Initiatives?
Very good.
Yeah, okay. And Don did a stint at both at the CEA and was acting director of CBO in 2006, and we'll talk about where this came up then. Steve McMillan is now with Policy Analytics, which is where he worked with Phil Graham. He was deputy director of OMB in the Bush administration, and Jared Bernstein is at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a senior fellow there, and did a stint as chief economist in Joe Biden's office. And I want to start with you, Donald, because when you were the acting director of CBO, you were confronted with an immigration bill, and you were involved in trying to figure out what the macroeconomic effects would be and how to dynamically analyze it. I don't know if you dynamically scored it. The difference being, of course, for people who aren't into the lingo here, dynamic analysis means you tell them what the macroeconomic effects are. Dynamically scoring means you actually figure that in to the official price tag. So talk to us a little about the immigration decision you had to make.
Sure. Well, thanks. So first, I want to emphasize that I think actually the dynamic scoring debate has so much focused on tax that I think the spending and regulatory policy angle of it has not gotten enough attention and is actually a place where these issues are going to be very important. So in 2006, much as then later happened in 2013, Congress was considering a major immigration bill that would have the effect of changing the size of the US population and changing the size of the US labor force by several million people. And at the time, the joint decision of JCT and CBO was that you couldn't ignore that in doing a score, that if you tried to follow the convention of holding macroeconomic aggregates constant, GDP, employment, total compensation, you would end up with results that were just completely nonsensical, right? So you'd be letting, 6 million new people join the labor force and you would be assuming that they're all unemployed, right? That would just literally be insane. And so for large immigration bills, the conventional now exception from the convention is to in fact take account of how those immigrants would affect the macroeconomy, but try to do it in a way that's respectful to the traditional distinction between kind of conventional scoring and macrodynamic. So there are actually now 3 categories of scoring that happens. Some folks today have used the phrase static, which I avoid because conventional scores by JCT and CBO are not static. They recognize that people respond. So if you change taxes, if you change spending, people will respond to that. If you pay doctors more, they might work more or they might work less. There's actually sometimes a sign debate about that. If you tax cigarettes, right, people will smoke less. So those are accounted for in conventional scores. For major immigration bills, what's taken account of are kind of the first order direct effects that happen to the macroeconomy. So you have a bigger labor force, you're going to have more people in the workforce, there's going to be more wages overall, that's going to result in more tax revenue, and then obviously you'll have more people around, and so you'll have more spending on various spending programs, and that you're going to want to track through the net of that. But what the CBO and JCT scores of immigration do today is they don't then take the next step and track through every indirect macroeconomic effect that would follow. And so, for example, they only account for some of the increased investment that would occur in response to enhanced immigration. They don't account for changes potentially in overall national productivity. And what they do, though, is they then analyze those in a separate report. So you have kind of a score that includes some change in the macroeconomic situation, and then you have an advisory report, much as we now have for tax bills, that tracks through the additional things that would be incorporated if you wanted to go fully macrodynamic.
And under the new rule, would that change?
So under the new rule, you would go through all of the things and try to incorporate all of them, assuming it triggered whatever, the 2.25% of GDP threshold.
Jared, much is often made of the inadequacy of American investment in infrastructure, public investment in infrastructure. As I understand the rule, it would be a little hard to, because they exempt appropriation bills. But in general, do you think if we're going to dynamically score tax cuts, we ought to dynamically score infrastructure? And wouldn't that make the case for infrastructure spending even more attractive?
Well, on the surface, it sounds like it would, but I think in practice, I fear that it wouldn't, and I fear that it is even harder to do that sort of thing than the tax kinds of scores that we've been discussing so far. Appropriations, this has a lot to do with budget process and the way CBO scores such measures, but appropriations are too uncertain generally for scores beyond a year. That is, the CBO can't sit there and say, here are the scores, here are the appropriations that we see in year 10. They can't even say, here are the appropriations that we're going to build in year 2. And so if a dynamic score showed positive effects for appropriations, it wouldn't show up beyond CBO's estimate of when those appropriations would be in place. A good example is the Highway Trust Fund. How could you possibly, if you're CBO, sit there and figure out what's going to happen with the Highway Trust Fund when it's going to go, allegedly go bust in May, which is a few months from now? Now, we can all assume a patch, and probably a patch will be in place, but I think it's a lot to ask CBO to do that.
Wait a minute. If I say I want to raise the gas tax, if I propose a bill, I want to raise the gas tax 50 cents a gallon, and I want to use all that money for infrastructure, couldn't that be dynamically scored?
That could be dynamically scored, and depending on the extent to which CBO believe that that would persist in future years, that might work. But there's another bias here, which is kind of a low productivity bias. So CBO writes, in a recent paper, for analysis of changes in federal investment, CBO's central estimate is that additional federal investment yields half the typical return on investment completed by the private sector with an average delay of 5 years. So CBO assumes for this kind of investment crowding out of private investment. And so that too would be a bias against the spending impacts of appropriations. And in fact, just speaking a touch more broadly, I tried to think about the positives and the negatives of dynamic scoring on the spending side, and all I could come up with were negatives. The idea that there are biases against spending scores being positive throughout the process. The most important one, just let me get it out on the table, is basically, and this is from work that Richard Kogan did, I didn't know about this, it's a bias that would lead any dynamic spending scores to simply provide more room for tax cuts, not for more spending. So the Budget Act enforces allocations on the revenue side, on the revenue target, and on the allocation target, and House and Senate rules disallow taxes to go below the revenue floor or appropriations to go above committees' allocations. Under the rule that we're talking about, the House Dynamic Scoring Rule, if we were to move towards scoring discretionary spending, CBO would estimate that any positive growth effects would be scored almost entirely as extra revenues, just by dint of the rule itself, not as something that would give you room on the spending side. You would only have the ability to cut taxes more, not to increase spending, based on what would pop out of the model.
Steve, we know that when Congress does things, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or immigration or other things, that they have some effect on the economy. Tell us what you think about dynamically scoring those. Is it A, a good idea, and B, is it possible?
In order, yes, absolutely a good idea. Possible in degrees. What we found, I think, from listening to the JCT folks on the tax side is if the new House rule had been implemented 10 years ago, the quality of what you would get would be at one level, but they've been working diligently all these years to improve that quality. There's been some level of analysis to make that happen on some types of spending programs. And when that type of analysis becomes more relevant to the policymaking process, I think you'll see investment in improvements in that. Now, it may be that in some areas, as we heard on the tax side, we just can't figure it out, it's too uncertain, the answer for purposes of this exercise is zero. And I think that's going to happen quite a bit to the extent this becomes more common on spending bills. I just want to comment on one thing Jared said. It's important to distinguish between the analysis itself and then what it's used for. So a good analysis on a large increase in infrastructure spending will inform the debate and tell policymakers how they ought to vote or what the results of their vote would be. But that doesn't always flow into the rules for consideration of legislation. Now, it is true that the feedback, if one assumes there's a growth effect from infrastructure, would be primarily on the revenue side. But if you pass a budget resolution in the Congress that assumes an increase in infrastructure investment, and you dynamically score that, that flows through all of the aggregates, and you'll find that the revenue aggregate takes into account those higher revenues from your investment in infrastructure. So it only creates the bias in the policy to the extent that a budget resolution leads to that result.
So I think that that may well be right, but I think you're assuming that somehow dynamic scoring, this rule, is going to lead Congress to increase its spending caps or to throw away sequestration or something like that, and I certainly don't make that assumption.
Well, and again, what do the same set of facts lead different policymakers to conclude is the right type of policy to pursue? In this particular case, I think when you're looking at a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate, it's not likely that that analysis is going to cause them to increase the spending caps. Every 6 years, or however often we do highway bills these days, out comes a rather simple model that Department of Transportation put back a while ago saying every $1 billion on highways is 17,000 jobs or 42,000 jobs or 27,000 jobs, depending on what year you did the estimate or the last time the model was updated. And people use that on both sides of the aisle to advocate more infrastructure spending. Sometimes that argument is successful, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, no, I think those are fair points, and I think we should definitely do more infrastructure spending, and CBO and everybody else should do dynamic analysis around it. The concerns that I'm trying to express here is that's one corner of a set of changes to this whole dynamic scoring debate that look to me like it would really lead to a bias in approving more tax cuts than I believe we can afford.
Donald, a lot of the bills that would clearly trigger the rule involve health. If it had been in place for the Affordable Care Act, if it had been in place for the Medicare drug prescription bill, if we ever do some big wholesale change to Medicare, put yourself in the position of the Congressional Budget Office. How challenging is it going to be to them to come up with some judgment about what effect big changes to health policy have on the economy?
Oh, so obviously a big challenge, right? A new area to look at. I think it's useful when you think about dynamically scoring any major bill, it's useful to put it kind of 3 bins, the effects you're worried about. So as Jane mentioned earlier, there's some short-run stimulus effects, either positive or negative, depending on what changes you're making that you may want to think about. In the longer run, there's the supply side effects. Are you doing something to increase the labor force, increase capital? For example, does something on the health side improve the quality of the American workforce? And then you have the crowding out effect, right? So to the extent that this is something that changes the budget balance over the 10-year window into the future, is it something that's crowding out or crowding in private investment? And so in principle, CBO would want to go down all those channels, right? Is there any short-run effect that's either boosting or harming the economy? If it's a reform that would increase the deficit, is that a reform? What are the effects of that that's going to be on investment? And then to try to track through how any of the changes might affect labor supply. We know from the discussion of CBO's analysis of the ACA, for example, that there's some interesting questions about how the implementation of the ACA may have affected the number of people who choose to be in the labor force over time. And so if there's a proposal that comes along to make changes to health reform, they're going to want to take those into account.
So can I make a comment about that? I agree with Don's comments, and I think that the ACA labor supply example is a very good one of the kinds of biases that I worry about. In this case, one that I've labeled a marginal utility bias or a social welfare function bias, which I actually think is non-trivial, and it's one that Elmendorf himself spoke of. So the ACA comes out, the CBO comes out with the ACA score, and it does have this kind of, this labor supply effect, part of which is by dint of allowing people to move from full-time to part-time work if that's what they want to do, because they can now afford to get health care, sometimes subsidized in the exchanges, you're releasing job lock. And I'm not making this up. This is something CBO said was part of the mix. Well, that in the hurly-burly of the debate where GDP is kind of elevated above everything and labor supply above everything, that's a big negative. So that came out to be, there was a big dust-up. This is not Don's fault. This is not CBO's fault. This is what happens when metrics like labor supply and GDP are elevated above all others. The social welfare of the nation was enhanced by unlocking job lock. And so a diminished labor supply is not an obviously bad thing unless you're fetishistic about labor supply and GDP. I like labor supply and GDP a lot, but I also think an increase in voluntary part-time work via unlocking of job lock is a very good thing, but I think it's outside the scope of dynamic scoring in a way that is problematic.
But that's just saying that Congress should not make all its decisions based on the scores, that they could decide that this will cost something, but it's worth it because it has goals. That's putting an awful lot that's true of any of the scores. I mean, Doug Elmendorf has said, I think in public, and Bob Reischauer did when he did the evaluation of the Clinton healthcare thing, that this should not be your only criteria.
Yeah, I mean, if a group of wise men and women were assessing precisely those kinds of considerations, I would feel a lot better.
This suggests that Congress doesn't meet that description. Just I want you to be okay. Yeah, please.
So this is a pressure you feel a lot at CBO, which is it's right. The B in CBO is budget, and the primary goal is to provide scores that guide the budget process. And the dynamic scoring discussion should really be about making those scores as good as possible. CBO provides important supplementary information, for example, on health reform, what would happen to coverage, right, which is influential, although not an official part of the process. But you do constantly run into these issues about people get mad that the budget process tends to elevate the budget numbers over other things that you might worry about from a social welfare point of view. But CBO is not the Congressional Cost Benefit Office. It is not the Congressional Social Welfare Function Office. It would sometimes be fun if it were. And so
That's joint tax, right? Joint tax is social welfare.
They're a barrel. We share it. No, but this is a very important challenge to think through, particularly if we expand what gets scored, which is that the budget number has to be treated appropriately in the overall policy discussion, weighed against other things.
Steve, let's say that it's 2009. We're in a deep recession. The president proposes a major fiscal stimulus, the ARRA. The chairman of the budget committees tell CBO, we want to know the dynamic score of this. Would that have been a good thing to do?
Absolutely, and certainly we saw some numbers from the CEA projecting what they thought the outcome of implementation of the president's policies would be, and there's now a record to compare that to. But in terms of the relevance of what that dynamic score would have been on the legislative process, on the enactment of those policies, the question of whether you were deliberately increasing the deficit by $750 billion or $850 billion or $600 billion or $1 trillion was not something that was really going to affect the outcome of that particular debate. There was a deliberate policy choice that we need to expand the deficit here over the next couple of years to try to get some beneficial effect in the economy. So if the feedback effect of that was baked into the official score, then people would have to go into their talking points and, scratch out one number and put a different number.
But it would have looked like a smaller price tag, and that might have paved the way to a bigger fiscal stimulus.
Perhaps, but unless you're up against, some arbitrary threshold like, the T word as opposed to 999 billion, the political forces, the political balance, I don't see is fundamentally changed. I mean, I think back to TARP.
That was my next question.
And some internal conversations about A, how much money do we need? B, how much money do we think we can get away asking for? And 500 billion, well, maybe not. But if you're asking for 500, you might as well ask for 700. Just don't ask for $1 trillion. And the people who thought TARP was terrible policy or were shocked by the price tag, I think would have been every bit as shocked at 500 billion as they were with the bill that actually went up.
Well, I think that I'm not sure that you would really get the help that you need. That I'm a huge advocate, as you know, if you know my work, I'm a huge advocate of temporary fiscal intervention in a Keynesian spirit at times like we faced in the heart of the Great Depression. And I think the kind of global results of austerity, which is fiscal contraction in the face of that, are exhibit A in what good fiscal policy looks like and what bad fiscal policy does, including political implications of that, which are on your front page of your paper today. But the thing is again, because of some of the biases built into, well, I don't know if they're biases. To me, they're biases. The rules in which these things are scored, I'm not even sure how much help you would get because through a more dynamic score of these Keynesian stimulus, because CBO correctly, I would say, views this as pulling demand forward. So you get some demand in the quarters where the policies are in place, but then you pay for it later, typically within the 10-year window. Here's where I would say, and this is not at all calling out CBO because they're just following basic rules of economics. I think many of the crowd out and crowd in estimates about interest rates and their impact on growth are wrong and becoming more incorrect over time. And the reason I think that is because of changes in the dynamics of global capital, of loanable funds throughout the world, of capital markets. And so I think that the extent to which CBO diminishes growth in later years relative to stimulus impacts in earlier years are too large. For example, I don't think that CBO does a very good job of estimating the amplified impact of fiscal stimulus when the Federal Reserve is at the zero lower bound. It's a very big deal. The multipliers go up by a factor of 2 or 3 based on some of the research on this. So those dynamics make it look like fiscal policy isn't as effective as it is, a stimulative fiscal policy.
Jared, what I'm hearing is CBO should improve the quality of its best judgment, not that we should ignore their best judgment.
I guess, I mean, that's definitely a fair interpretation of what I'm saying, and they definitely should. My point is that of the earlier panel, which I think when I was kind of getting at this fundamental question, do we have enough knowledge to do that in a method that improves our score? No. Yes, in terms of analysis. So I would answer your question, yeah, we should absolutely do that in terms of analysis. We're not there yet in terms of choosing a score.
Okay, I want to turn to the audience, and I want to ask, we'll have time for a few questions at the end about tax. But I'd like to start with people who have a question about the non-tax bills. Gentleman right here. Mike's coming to you. Tell us who you are, please.
I'm Vic Miller. I'm an independent fiscal economist. I've worked both in OMB as a fiscal economist and a couple of years for Ed Muskie on the Senate Budget Committee. And one of the things we knew was we wanted to get the assumptions out of the way so we could argue policy with the House. So here we have a rule that's a House rule that Rich Kogan has pointed out will, have impacts not at the spending side but also on the revenue side. And Steve has said this will be taken care of in the budget resolution. Are you assuming that the Senate will implicitly assume this rule for its purposes in putting together the budget resolution?
I I don't have knowledge of that. What I mean to say is, to the extent the official scoring process incorporates macroeconomic feedback, then any bias that is introduced in terms of spending versus revenue, that, if in fact beneficial spending produces a revenue surge in later years, the strict rules of the budget right now do not allow you to mix and match spending and revenues. But a budget resolution, if that is a preferred policy, does allow that. That was the only point I was making.
Anybody else on spending? Or do we want to? Nobody? Anybody? All right.
It's really important, really.
Do you guys want to wait?
Can I make?
There's a gentleman there in the back. By the doors, by the fire alarm. Please don't touch it.
I'm Basil Scarless. I just have a question. What was the rationale behind the House ignoring spending in its rule? I just think it should be made explicit.
I don't think it's quite right to say they ignored spending.
Discretionary.
What they said was it would apply to mandatory spending or entitlements, but not to appropriations.
And I had no hand in creating that rule, but my own guess as to why they went that way. First of all, as a practical matter, annual increases of at least $40 billion in any appropriated program are extremely rare. And so it's unlikely that would be triggered at any point. Secondly, as Jared pointed out, appropriations are 1 year at a time things, and so the budget rules don't take into account future effects of appropriations as it stands now. So you might produce an analysis that is interesting about appropriations, but the way the budget rules are structured, it would have no impact on the enforcement of budget limitations for that bill.
Exactly right. And if you think about the bias that creates, so imagine somebody, I think it was Chai Ching was talking about education spending that boosts productivity, certainly arguably in later years. Well, since it's allocated year by year, CBO couldn't score it. And that would create a negative bias in terms of a way in which spending would have a positive growth effect.
And again, this is a distinction between what is inadequate about the current system. To have information about what happens to our economy when you spend more on education, to the extent we can get that information, is very interesting.
Agreed.
The fact that we have budget rules that count $1 in the 10th year the same as $1 in the first year, and completely ignore $1 in the 11th year, yeah, that's a process that is in need of improvement. But having analysis that does show us what happens in those years still helps people figure out how to vote when they're in Congress.
Questions on anything? Relevant to dynamic scoring. Eric.
Right, very small technical question. In looking at the Affordable Care Act, I mean, Jared mentioned job lock, and I'm sure that labor supply issues are taken into account. But since the purpose of the act was to improve the access to health insurance and the health of the population, is there any way that gets factored into estimates of productivity or can be factored in?
Donald.
I think the answer is aspirationally, but I don't know what the evidentiary base for that is.
Go.
Thanks. This is a question I didn't get to ask my panel, so I'll ask this panel. There's a great discussion of how private sector agents will respond, individuals, businesses, et cetera. There's a little discussion, although it's not framed this way, about how the federal government will respond. The whole financing issue is a question of if you have a non-revenue neutral proposal, then what does the federal government do to make up the budget shortfall? But I want to ask about both state and local governments and foreign governments. Suppose we did something like limit the deductibility of state and local taxes. You would expect that to have an impact on state and local governments. They would have to respond somehow. If we cut the federal corporate tax rate, you would expect other countries to respond and to offset some of that impact. The question, I guess, is how comfortable are you with how far we go in estimating policy policymaker responses other than the federal government.
Pam, do you want to respond to that? Donald as well.
Well, I think, no, I guess not.
There to help you.
Okay, so,
Tom,
so
do you
I'll-
want to respond? Donald.
No, so I'll take a crack at beginning that. So when I was at CBO, I sat in meetings where we tried to predict the behavior of other parts of government. So we had meetings where we tried to predict whether the Supreme Court would judge a particular provision to be constitutional or not. We had lots of meetings where many laws are written where they delegate to the administrator of a program the opportunity to make a choice about how to run the program several years in the future. And so it's not, you can't go to the economic literature and find an estimate of how you're going to respond. You have to collect evidence, sometimes see what they've said in public, assuming they're already in office, and you do a best judgment of how is this person going to behave. If you go down the macro route, you've got to put in your thinking a model of how the Federal Reserve will respond, because it just isn't appropriate to assume the Fed is just going to maintain a constant course. I think you have to do a similar thing with overseas governments. You already do it with state and local governments. You know, a big issue in many health things, for example, is how will state governments respond to changes in health policy. And there are lots of estimates that CBO does where, you know, somewhere behind the scenes, someone is deciding that, you know, these 25 states are going to do X and these 25 states are going to do Y. And you have varying levels of evidentiary base for doing that, but it's essential in order to have a plausible estimate. And so the goal, right, the aspiration of the goal really is to do that in all the cases where it matters. And if there's someone's response out there, you want to incorporate it with the sole exception of future legislation. Because since your goal is to score the legislation in front of you, you do not want to be in the position of predicting what future legislation will follow that.
Okay, so,
Wait,
that suggests, which I think has been a theme of this thing, is that there's a limit to what you can do with models. There's going to be judgment in these
Absolutely.
estimates, as there is in static estimates. But do you think that asking the JCT and the CBO to dynamically score things adds an excessive layer of uncertainty and judgment that will make the estimates less useful or not?
I think in general, it's hard to have an in general. I think there are going to be some cases where it's yes and some cases it's no. And I will note that CBO has been quite strong historically. With some effects, it will basically give a zero or a very small effect where there just isn't a strong evidentiary base to be one way or the other. Health IT used to be a classic example of that. Preventative measures in health are another. Tort reform. And there's just like a whole bunch of issues where people on either side feel very, very strongly about it, but if there isn't a strong base of evidence to conclude one way or the other, the institutional goal, or not goal, but the institutional prior is to go with a smaller zero effect. And I think what we'll see with dynamic scoring is something similar, which if there isn't a strong reason to go one way or the other, they're not going to give a big cherry-picked effect from one
Just a
end to the
quick
other.
point. I thought Don's initial answer to the question was very good and very comprehensive, and I agree with it. But I think at the end of your first comment, not the one you just made, you gave a pretty compelling reason why we shouldn't accept models that close the fiscal model, because they de facto assume legislation, legislation that either either raises, cuts transfers, raises taxes. I'm saying when you're in that situation where you have to close the fiscal model in order to get it to converge, you have to make assumptions about how debt doesn't explode relative to GDP. That's a legislative assumption. That's assuming what a later Congress
But does
will
that
do.
apply in the 10-year window?
Right.
Do I have, if you make an LLG assumption, does that apply in the 10-year window?
And it can apply in the 10-year window, but more importantly, since the decision makers in the model have perfect foresight, they can observe what you're doing outside the 10-year window, and they will have a behavioral response to that. So that's the way the model works. So it's hard to find something that will have no effect.
Okay. Pam and Nick, do you want to add anything, respond to anything? I want to make sure you don't get slighted. No? Okay. I think we're out of time. I want to, remind you all that we have Tax Policy Center has an event on January 30th, which is in LA on international tax, but will be webcast. And we here at the Hutchins Center have an event which is going to touch on a lot of these issues to marking the 40th anniversary of the Congressional Budget Office. What do they do well? What don't they do well? What challenges do they face? You're invited to all those. Secondly, if you look at your feet and there's a piece of paper or a coffee cup, pick it up and put it in the recycling can at the back. Makes me very popular with our conference people. And third, join me in thanking all the participants, but particularly the people from CBO who came, from JCT. I tried to get CBO, but they pled that because their forecast coming out this afternoon, they couldn't do it. But I really do want to thank the people from JCT. It's not easy to stand up and answer these questions and not know what Tom Barthol's going to say when you get back to the office. I think they did an excellent job, so thank you all.